Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Thursday lecture series organized by the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center in the Humanities. My name is Renzo Aroni. I will be moderating today's lecture. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Alberto Vergara, who will be talking about the concept of republic as a theoretical tool to address the different social outbreaks and institutional discontents in Latin America, including the recent massive movement protest in Colombia, Chile, and Peru. And before moving to his talk, let me briefly say about his background. Professor Vergara, who is a political scientist who teaches and researches at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima, Peru, and he was a postdoctoral researcher at Harvard University after completing his PhD at the University of Montreal. He has taught courses on Latin American politics at several universities in the Americas and Europe, and his research has focused mainly on the Andean nations, observing different dimensions of the political regimes, such as citizenship, representations, technocracies, political violence, accountability, and subnational powers. His articles have appeared in the Journal of Politics in Latin America, Latin American Research Review, Journal of Democracy, among others. He has published and co-edited several books in Spanish and English, including The Politics After Violence, Legacies of the Shining Path Conflict in Peru, co-edited with Hilol Soifer, and La Condena de la Libertad de Tupac Amaru II al Bicentenario Peruano en 6 ensayos y un colofón, co-edited with Paulo Drinot. That was published last year, if I'm not mistaken. In a more journalistic manner, Professor Vergara has collaborated with different international media, including the New York Times. In Peru, his articles have often appeared in magazines and newspapers. And last year, he published his first children's book, Ota, la gaviota que tenía vértigo. It can be translated like Oda, the seagull who had vertigo. So I understand that's a kind of inspiration based on your connection, interaction with your song. So it's really beautiful. His talk today is part of his new book that you are seeing now on the screen, La República Defraudada, asomarse al malestar contemporáneo en América Latina e imaginar caminos para revertirlo, which will be out next month, I'm sure, in April. So after his talk, we will open a conversation during the Q&A portions. And so we'll open kind of comments, questions for you. And let's welcome Professor Vergara for this important talk that we have an opportunity to learn more about Latin America and Peru. Thank you.
So good afternoon. Thank you very, very much for the Society of Fellows and the Heyman Center for the Humanities for this invitation. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Thanks very much, Renzo, for that kind of introduction. So thank you very much. When I got invited to this talk on the broad topic of failure, let me say that I was surprised about how almost perfect was the match of the topic and my recent intellectual mood regarding Peru, my country, and Latin America in general. I mean, these recent years have been usually criticized for being too pessimistic or dark. So every time that I have to give a talk or make a presentation, I feel guilty about being obscure, and I force myself to keep some room for the to give the bright side of the story I'm telling, right? Though it's not the way I feel sometimes. So when this invitation arrived on, you have to talk on failure. That's my thing, right? That's what I was waiting for. So I will not be forced to end up quoting something like, there is a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in, right? Despite all my love for Leonard Cohen, of course. So thanks very much. So today I'm going to present the argument of my new book that you're seeing the cover over there. It's going to be out in April. In Spanish, titled Repúblicas Defraudadas, and the subtitle changed since the last time I talked with Renzo, and its subtitle is ¿Puede América Latina escapar de su atasco? So can Latin America overcome their impasse? That would be one possible translation. So I think it might be interesting to start speaking a bit on the origin of the book. In 2019, Latin America saw several episodes of social unrest. Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Venezuela, there were massive protests in all those countries. The year before, for sure, Nicaragua had massive unrest that ended up in a horrible massacre of hundreds of citizens. In 2020 was the turn for Peru. In 2021, we saw like bigger protests, the biggest protest in a generation in Cuba. So there was political turmoil. And in addition to that, pandemics show that huge inequalities in Latin America made the region particularly unfit to deal with the disease. So both wide political unrest and the unfit management of the pandemic forced people to ask, what is going on in Latin America? Suddenly, the questions were no longer about what is happening in Brazil or Peru, Argentina or Colombia, but what about Latin America as a whole? Articles, roundtables, seminars, op-eds were organized around the regional inquiry. Latin America as a distinctive region was back in the center of the political and intellectual or academic questions. The unconfessed premise of the question is that something common must be sweeping the continent if we have all these similar outcomes happening in many countries. A premise that is not the natural reflex in social sciences, with its emphasis on splitting the objects of study. Political scientists doing comparative politics, as myself, we tend to look for differences between the countries, focusing especially on national institutions, right? But now we were in 2020, politics and pandemics were driving us to think about the region rather than about the countries belonging to Latin America. So right in the middle of the pandemic, so I decided to start to throw some ideas to address that question. If I could catch what was going on in Latin America as a whole. It was the end of 2020, and I opened like some files in my computer, and I started to throw some ideas with different themes, variables, dimensions, problems that I thought could be driving the Latin American moment. However, immediately I recognized that I was unable to engage that task in a pure academic manner. Not only because we were still under different forms of lockdown in Latin America, so it was impossible to travel to do proper fieldwork, but because I was trying to ask a super complex question. What is going on in Latin America? The question sounds more like a Marvin Gaye song than a research question, right? So I realized that what I was building, these unconnected blocks, pointing in different directions on the contemporary problems of Latin America, were not the blocks, could not be the blocks of an academic work. I had to write a book from which its starting point was the urgence to share some thoughts on this crucial moment in Latin America. And to do that sort of book, a kind of book that the French would call un livre d'intervention, I had to lean on the old genre of the ensayo latinoamericano, the Latin American essay, ensayar, to try, to attempt, right? To attempt to try like a intellectual genre. But okay, enough for the making of the book. So what is happening in Latin America these days? My argument is that two interrelated things are happening in the region. A wide and deep malaise in the citizenry, which is derived from a stuck continent in different fronts, institutional, social, economic, political. And that impasse, the fact that we're not in the track of development, let's say, produces the wide sense of malaise or citizen dissatisfaction. So let's start with the mood in the region these days. Several indicators point out to a moment in which citizens show decaying levels of trust in their political and economic system. But here's a key question. On whose behalf Latin America citizens think governments rule? Around 80% of the Latin Americans think that governments do not rule for people, but for a minority of powerful groups. All the numbers graphs that I will show come from the Latino Barometro in his last edition. In some countries like Brazil and Mexico, this number might be above 90%. So it is widely perceived that the system is rigged. And same thing if we focus on the level of trust on institutions. That's from 2010 to the last measure, right? We never had strong institutions or super legitimate, that's for sure. But you can see these are the numbers of people trusting these essential institutions, right? Less than 20% trust, for example, political parties. And we could add other indicators in the same direction. For example, the number of people willing to accept that an executive completely overrules the legislative has doubled in the last years. For a long time then, the trust levels on key components of governance have been decreasing in the region. Latin Americans have become super critical regarding their political, social, and economic systems. They do not perceive them as fair. These perceptions have been there and have deteriorated for a while, but it's only in recent years that the constant trends have given way to a more political and concrete manifestations. For example, let's take, for example, the last 17 competitive elections in Latin America. Roughly speaking, half of them were won by the left or the center left, and half by the right or the center right. There is not, hence, in the continent, a sweeping left or right turn, as some journalists like to highlight. However, there is indeed a clear common trend, but it's not ideological. In all the 17 elections, the incumbents, either the candidate or the party in office, were defeated. No one got reelected. Latin Americans are using elections to punish their politicians rather than to advance programs or agendas, regardless if they are left or right. In addition to this electoral manifestation of the constant social malaise, a new element has started to surface the region. Very violent social protest that is met with brutal repression by the state. This is new, or at least we had not seen it for a long time. So according to official sources, for example, the so-called Chilean estallido social from 2019 produced 34 deaths. In Colombia, The social outbreak of 2021 produced 29 deaths. And currently, in the last 3 months, around 60 people have died in the protests. In Peru, 48 of them, all the evidence points in that way, were assassinated by bullets fired by the police or the army. And to this trend in Latin America, we could add what happened in Brazil, for example, when Bolsonaro's followers stormed the buildings of the main institutions in the country, looking to start a coup against the recently elected President Lula da Silva. Therefore, for some reason, in different places, society is showing increasing levels of violence, and at the same time, the state looks unprepared to deal with that, generating deaths and unacceptable levels of repression in democracies. So my point is, for this first section, is that regional service had captured for a long time the levels of dissatisfaction in Latin America. But now that silent dissatisfaction, let's say, has given way to new political situations, to huge political and social turmoil. So why is that? What is happening in the region? We could say that academic disciplines engage that question about what is happening in Latin America from different perspectives. Economists will refer to Latin America's that Latin America is trapped in a middle income trap, right? The middle income trap in Latin America. The continent is unable to grow enough to become a continent of rich nations. As you can see in the graph, in recent years, the economic growth in Latin America decreased. I mean, beyond the rebound from the pandemic, right? And this slow decay in the growth was right before this wave of protests and malaise that I have highlighted. So this might be part of the story, right? Same thing for inequality. Also, economists focusing on inequality will point out to a very, very unequal continent that improved during the 2000s, decreasing the super high levels of inequality, but then starting in 2010, that trend stopped or became quite shy in the countries, right? We're still, in any case, super unequal region, the most unequal in some views, depending on how you aggregate the countries. From political science, we will point out to the increasing problems of legitimacy of the democratic regime. The citizens' satisfaction, it's in its lowest level in decades. That 48% there that you see for 2018 is the lowest level since the 90s, when this survey started to be taken. So a bunch of processes has led to this situation, and very recently, professors Aníbal Pérez-Liñán and Scott Mainwaring defined the current situation as the stagnation of Latin American democracy. So from these arguments, we can answer to the question about what is happening in Latin America. And the answer is that too many different things are happening in the region. Several dimensions, all mixed up, are fueling this moment of malaise. So the intellectual challenge is how to grasp such complexity, how to have a theory, a vocabulary that might integrate such different sources of stagnation. They are different and cannot be reduced, I think, to autonomous problems that strictly belong to one academic discipline or another. So the analytical challenge seems to be how to integrate knowledge rather than to separate it. In the old jargon of social sciences, I think it's the moment to side with the lampers and not with the splitters. Okay, so how to tackle such endeavor? How to keep some analytical parsimony in attempting to integrate political, social, economic dimensions when speaking of a region with 20 countries and diverse contexts. And especially how to do that and not being accused of producing arguments that is just one damn thing after another, which is coming from political science. That's the worst thing that can happen to you, right? I think the idea of republic and republicanism might help to put some analytical order for such task. Of course, I'm referring to the old political tradition of republicanism and not in any sense to the grand old party of these days. Tulio Alperindongui, the great Argentinian historian, famously said that Argentina was born liberal. Well, Latin America was born Republican. When Latin American countries gained independence from Spain early in the 19th century, they all chose the Republican form of government, with the brief exception of Mexico in two ephemeral experiments and Brazil that followed a different path since it only became a republic in 1889. Latin America was born under the idea of self-government, the sovereignty of people, and the equality of the citizen before the law. Latin American countries were born under the promises of republicanism. This is not tantamount to say that there was a homogeneous consensus on those principles. Many actors were against, and several, especially elites, were enthusiastic to put those principles in constitutions, but much less in putting them to effectively rule the social and political interactions of a continent that was composed of highly unequal and segregated societies. That is why several Latin American thinkers established since the 19th century that Latin America was simultaneously modern and traditional. Still, I would argue that republicanism was not a mere trap or fraud. It was a political project that country after country, they choose for themselves. Actually, as many historians have highlighted, especially, for example, François Xavier Guerra, the resilience of such republicanism can be gauged in the fact that no alternative project was institutionalized after the independence. Republicanism in Latin America arrived to stay. What is very different to state that it was successful, but I will talk about that later. Okay, what is a republic and what does it mean as a political project? I'm not a political philosopher, but building on the work of Machiavelli, Tocqueville, and Hannah Arendt among the classics, and Quentin Skinner and Philippe Petit among the contemporary ones, I define republicanism as a political project that seeks the self-government of a community of citizens. And building on Amartya Sen ideas, I stress that such project requires effective agency. Agency in two dimensions. First, as a political community that is able to work together to produce a public government that is respected by the citizenry. In a second dimension, it means that such community must be composed of citizens that are agents, are able to define and seek their individual projects in life. That is, citizens that are able in an egalitarian base to pursue their happiness, to quote the Declaration of the American Independence, right? That implies the agents can choose, implies that their destiny should not be overwhelmingly shaped by any sort of hereditary condition, but by their own personal preferences. Actually, that is why the modern citizen is the antithesis of the old Ancien Régime, made of differentiated states or castes in which the group defines what the individual can or cannot be or do. In the Ancien Régime, he cannot choose, right? But in a republic, the expectation is that it is agency that will shape the individual and the communal destiny. So a decent republic requires citizens that enjoy similar doses of freedom for two purposes. One is individual, to look for the preferences they consider the best for their lives. And second, similar doses of freedom to participate of the political and public life in order to shape the common government. So from the Republican perspective, liberty and equality are equally relevant and not antinomies as the main ideologies of the 20th century used to saw them, right? In a republic, agents must have similar doses of agency. That is why Alexis de Tocqueville would say that a regime enjoying freedom is one composed of both the democratic component, the égalité de conditions, equality of conditions, and the institutions of freedom that allow the self-government. But most of the times when we talk about a republic, we refer to a particular political regime. But what I contend is that that sort of political regime also requires a socio-economic order that permits the republic government. In other words, that a kind of institution is related to a kind of society. That is why Machiavelli, for example, great enthusiast of the Roman Republic, stated that in an unequal society, you should establish a sort of monarchy. And he recommended to establish a republic in places enjoying equality, right? A republic then is an order with, I would argue, political and social dimensions. Therefore, derived of this, to fulfill its promises, a republic needs at least three components. A kind of person that we call the citizen, a sort of government that assures that what is public is shaped by the will of all citizens, and a sort of society in which no one captures so much power, social or economic, that can cancel the will of others or that can twist the will of the authorities or to circumvent the law. Well, that is what we lack in Latin America. We are fully aware that we are not what we promised to be. We have been shaped by 2 centuries of Republican promises and premises. We have sung them in hymns, repeated in official histories, said with pomp in constitutions, but they are unequivocally betrayed in a daily basis. We are a continent of betrayed republics. To understand that, then, we have to peer into the 3 analytical elements of a republic: the republic as a society, the republic as a government, and the citizen. That is the analytical framework that allows me to integrate the knowledge about the different dimensions that co-produce the current Latin American stagnation and that therefore produce the continental malaise. Let's start with what I call the República en tanto sociedad, or the republic as a society. Let's start with some inequalities. But continent plagued with drastic inequalities. Of course, there are differences. I mean, Uruguay is far more egalitarian than Panama. But still, they all belong to the group of unequal countries of the world. Taking the Gini coefficient, for example, Uruguay, the most egalitarian country in Latin America, has a similar coefficient than the US, the most unequal country among the rich ones, right? So even our best, the poster child of Latin America in terms of equality is an unequal country if we place it among the developed ones. So inequalities in Latin America are so huge that they tend to reproduce themselves. And because of that, they plot against most of the agents. Inequalities are not ephemeral. Ephemeral or ephemeral? I don't know. Anyway, you got it. They are not the product of citizens' abilities or luck. For most of the society, those inequalities function like unsurmountable social and economic legacies. Let's think about social mobility in the region. Florencia Torche, a professor at Stanford University, says that Latin America is the most immobile continent in the world. That is, the levels of wealth of the present generation anticipate quite well how it's going to do the next generation. We suffer from sticky floors and sticky ceilings, to use the term, a term that is from the World Economic Forum. That means that in Latin America, it's very hard to be born in the upper echelons of society and to die in the lower parts of the pyramid. In the same way, most of those being born in the less affluent quintiles of society will not abandon them. So ceilings and floors are sticky. In Mexico, Brazil, or Peru, for example, less than 3% of the ones being born in the 5th quintile will reach the 1st quintile in their lives. So we're not in front of societies where the destiny of the citizen is codified by the law with well-institutional castes. But however, the economic pyramid has such disparities that it's very hard for someone to escape from hereditary conditions. There are not formal castes, as in the Ancien Regime, but the possibility of going up or down in the socioeconomic ladder resembles to that kind of old immobile order. So the formal Republican promises clash every day with an economic context that break those promises in front of everyone. For example, according to a World Bank report, in Peru, the level of parents' income anticipates in 66% of the cases the economic differences among their children. Right? That looks more like an ancien regime than a republic driven by citizens' choices. And that is why in the global ranking of social mobility, that ranking with 82 countries, all the Latin American countries are placed, almost all in place in the second half of the ranking of social mobilization, social mobility, I'm sorry. Okay, so, but economic disparities are not the only ones preventing an egalitarian use of the agent's agency. Race and gender also work like a damaging trap against that, sort of inequality that Mike Savage, professor in LSE, calls visceral inequalities. That picture you might recognize comes from the Mexican film Roma, directed by Alfonso Cuarón. She's the main character of the movie, Cleo, played by Yalitza Aparicio. And I use the picture because in the book, the chapter in which I explain what is a citizen and what should be a citizen is built on two Latin American movies. One is Roma and the other is La Historia Oficial, the Argentinian movie from the 80s. Both films have females as main characters, and it allows me to show the limits and possibilities of the citizen and its agency. So the visceral inequalities that I was talking about, the ones that Cleo suffered, and many Cleos still suffer in Latin America. In Mexico, for example, according to some research, the best predictor of a person's wealth and her level of education is race. In Peru, my colleagues of the Universidad del Pacífico did an experiment with disturbing results. They sent hundreds of identical CVs to job offers, only changing names and pictures in them. They found that the job market punishes three conditions: being a woman, having an indigenous family name, and punishes the picture of someone with indigenous origins. So if you're a woman of indigenous ancestry and an indigenous family name, if you have all these three factors, finding a job in the formal sector is very, very hard. So the job market is not ruled only by the formal CV laws, but by deep discriminatory practices. Hence, different social variables plot against citizens' agency. That doesn't mean that there is a general lack of agency for everyone, but it means that for a vast group, their talent and effort will not be enough to break with the weight of the past. Also, plotting against the citizens' agency is a sort of capitalism that prevails in Latin America, a capitalism that is not competitive enough. Weak states allow markets to be plagued with collusion, cartels, price fixing, and other practices that make them, the markets, non-competitive. Ben Ross Snyder from the MIT calls it the sort of capitalism that prevails in Latin America, the hierarchical capitalism. And its main features are that that sort of capitalism is not innovative, it has low levels of productivity, and it is dominated by a low-skilled labor force. And I place that picture because it illustrates a huge case of collusion that happened in Chile. Two main firms in the market colluded for a long time to fix the prices of toilet paper for more than a decade, and they earn millions and millions of dollars from that. And that's not like a rare case in Latin America. That happens all the time. Everywhere in Latin America, there are these kind of non-competitive practices that imposes an unfair burden, especially on the poorest citizens, because usually these practices are about the like most important products for everyone, right? According to a report by the World Bank, making Latin American markets more competitive could have a bigger impact in reducing poverty than the impact that all the social programs have in those countries. Another huge problem related to the Latin American economy and the markets is its duality between the formal and informal sector. Although there are huge differences in disparity, in general terms, in Latin America, there is an island of small formal sector providing good jobs, while there is a notion of small businesses, most of which are informal and hence generate precarious jobs. As you can see in the graph, only 2% of the enterprises are large or medium-sized in the region. This is a huge problem because this duality favors and creates inequality in Latin America. So inequality in Latin America is not only a matter of a state unable to redistribute the nation's income. Before that action, inequality is the product of a sort of capitalism that contains such disparity, right? This is, of course, a huge topic. I'm not an economist, but I think it's undeniable that this unsophisticated capitalism has strong consequences in Latin America. Michael Reed, who was longtime the editor of the Americas in The Economist, put it, while Asian countries build factories, Latin America tends to erect shopping malls, right? So the socioeconomic realm, I haven't gone to education and health, but it's not an open space for the citizenry. There are many mechanisms preventing that the citizen can freely choose. And this situation is related to the lack of a republic as a government. Government in a republic should prevent that citizenry is trapped in such social and economic dynamics, frustrating its agency. And I will show two additional dimensions where governments are failing to assure equal doses of freedom to their citizens. One is crime and insecurity. In several places in Latin America, citizens live an unbearable context of violence. The chart you're seeing is the presence of homicides in Latin America compared to other regions in the world. We have 9% of the world population, but we have 39% of the global homicides, right? That's why the World Health Organization calls it a pandemic of homicide in the region. And as a result, as you can see in the graph, since 2010, crime and insecurity displays other problems in the region as the main citizens' problem. Only with pandemics, health displays it, though we can guess that this will change, and insecurity will be, again, the main problem for the citizenry, right? And the violence and the fear to suffer violence prevent the possibility of enjoying civil and political rights. And this is even more acute for women and the LGBT community. According to some research, many times women in Latin America prefer to turn down jobs when they imply spending too much time in the public transport or in the streets because of the dangers that this generates. Another side of the problem is that more and more political process and state institutions are penetrated by criminal activities. Researchers like Javier Aullero and Benjamin Lessing highlights the way in which state is more and more intertwined with criminal activities. Finally, another institutional bottleneck in Latin America is in the system of democratic representation. This is part of a global trend in which political parties are no longer able to link states and society. You have like all parties are in troubles in this new century, changes in technology and more complex society. We all know that parties are struggling to represent these different societies. But if all parties have a hard time in trying to represent the 21st century with 20th century organizations, as many political scientists have stated, new parties are not doing better in Latin America. According to political scientists Gerardo Munk and Juan Pablo Luna, who recently updated the database by Professor Steven Levitsky and colleagues on parties in Latin America, between 1978 and 2021, 307 parties were created in Latin America, and 92% of them failed to take root, and only 5% were successful. I will not go into details about how was this data built, but the main message is clear. So we lack linkages between, the linkages between society and politics have become lighter and ephemeral. And as a consequence, of course, trust in parties has decreased in these recent years, and as a result, of course, this Republican ideal of self-government through representatives has become harder to reach. So let's try to wrap up all those information to finish. So politically, socially, and economically, Latin America is stuck. We're not an underdeveloped region that is developing. The region is defined by stagnation. We're not behind the goal of development. We're on a track that does not lead to prosperity and freedom. And as a William Blake's poem classically stated, expect poison from standing waters. That is, the multiple stagnation fuels an increasing malaise in the continent. As academic, I think it is important to recognize that such malaise does not come from isolated dimensions that overlap our disciplinary boundaries. Citizens are angry with a general order of things that they perceive not fair, which includes historical, economic, political, and social factors. Of course, dealing with so many factors is complicated and risky, but I think the vocabulary of republicanism might help to harmonize them, right? At the end of the day, it is an old political tradition in the region, and its premises and promises are deeply shared in the region. It is not that arbitrary to use it as an analytical device. It has a conceptual and historical way that justifies its rehabilitation in the Latin American context. But not only analytical. I think my purpose in the book is also a political one, a book written by a concerned citizen. The promises and the premises of the Republic run deep in the continent, and they create natural expectations in citizens of being treated as equals, and that social, political, and economic institutions should assure similar levels of choice for everyone. We were born as a republic, and we know their premises and promises, but their daily betrayal produce poison, to adopt Blake's metaphor. In his great book on the arguments in favor of capitalism, Albert Hirschman asked, and I quote, "What social order could long survive the dual awareness that it was adopted with the firm expectation that it would solve certain problems, and that it clearly and abysmally fails to do so?" And I think that is the key to understand Latin America today. We adopted republics in order to be citizens, and we gained democracies in the 80s to make that possible, and we opened our economies in the last decades in order to make prosperity possible. And the booming years reduced poverty and inequality, but it was short-lived. So we have that dual awareness that Hirschman speaks about it. We recognize our expectation and also their failure. We recognize every day that social, economic, and institutional conditions that cannot assure to all citizens to benefit from similar doses of agencies, right? For many, the personal autonomy and the capacity to be part of the community's self-government is just too far away. According to different research, we can summarize the situation of citizenship in Latin America in the next way. There is a minority, not even 20% of the population, that can effectively enjoy the full package of citizens' rights. They are the complete citizens. Then around 70% of the population enjoys some rights, but not others, right? This means that most of the continent is constituted of semi-citizens. And finally, around, or depending on the country, but around 20% of the population cannot be considered citizen in any sense of the word, since no rights is guaranteed for them. So we know that our republics were not found to achieve that. Their expectations, the citizens' expectations, are betrayed. And people know that the situation is not improving. They perfectly know that the citizens' freedom is just enjoyed by some, and that is something that should not happen in a republic of citizens. So in these betrayed republics, we were sort of semi-citizenry. Or as I like to summarize, and I will finish with that, I like to summarize that with a line from the great salsa composer Rubén Blades. In one of his songs, he has this character that he describes in a way that I think fits quite well the Latin America citizenry. Blades, or Blades, as he uses the name now, says of this character that sin ser esclavo, tampoco está en libertad. And I think we're in a similar position. Without being a slave, we're neither free. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you very much, Alberto, again. And I guess we should open the questions, comments for our speaker. Emma?
Hi, thank you. Wow, thank you so much for that. I'm gonna hold this farther away for that talk. I have two questions about capitalism and republicanism, respectively. So I'm curious about, and thinking broadly about failure, and I so appreciated your introduction into thinking about failure. I'm curious about the failures of capitalism being leveraged to make an argument about the recuperation and possibility of capitalism. My understanding of your argument, if I'm following, is that the problem with capitalism is that it has been poorly implemented, and that a purer and fairer and more competitive market would potentially offer more justice and a fairer distribution of resources. And I'm thinking here specifically with the Paro Nacional, the national strike in Colombia, and one of the recurring refrains was, la pobreza no es un accidente, so poverty is not an accident. And in my understanding of the critiques, many of them Afro-Indigenous, that emerged from the Paro, for example, and I'm not sure if this is true in the context of other uprisings in Peru or in Chile, the critique is actually of capitalism itself. And the argument is that there is no recuperation possible, and that capitalism is in fact functioning very much the way that it was intended to do. So my first question is a little bit about the failures of capitalism as a site for the recuperation of capitalism, and a pro-capitalist argument built through an understanding of failures of the present. And my second, which is similar, is about sort of the birth of republicanism. We're reading Carta de Jamaica this week in my class, so I'm thinking about this, and I was just reading my students, which is the Jamaica letter written by Simón Bolívar, and I was just reading students' responses, and interestingly, my students are very critical. They mention that women, indigenous people, and non-landed people are excluded from that vision of the republic. So while an argument is being made, what we might think of as a savvy post-colonial argument that contrasts the new Gran Colombia from Spain, it certainly is an elite white landowning project, much like the US Constitution. And so I'm curious, in the context of understanding republicanism as an explicitly genocidal project, in the way that it was born as a settler project, how we might imagine a revamped and remade republicanism that can offer freedom for all people. So thank you.
Okay, so I will move a see the person. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's those are two key questions. I don't doubt that more mobilized and radical sectors will criticize capitalism as itself, and that there is no way to recuperate it, and that we have to go to other sort of economic organization. But I think that's not the general sense in Latin America. I think people, if you see the surveys, I would say that people are angry with that state of, with that situation in which states are just not strong enough to make competition possible. So I would not say that the general feeling is that we have to get rid of capitalism and go to some sort of alternative economic order. And actually, I think something that is important, and I think for the sake of my argument, is that something that I would like to stress, and maybe I haven't, is that I'm not proposing that we're talking about small things that if we like some details that if we get rid of them we will be okay. That's not my argument. I think what happens is unacceptable, right? And if you see the way in which this sort of non-competitive capitalism, the effects it have on the poorest sectors of society, to change that would not be a minor change. If you had a state that is able to force the firms and enterprises to compete, that would be a really important change. I'm not saying that everything will change, but I think it would be very different from what we have today. So it's not just like a tiny reform. What I'm talking about is to really change. And republicanism, sure, everything in the everything in the, if you take any concept in the 19th century, it was much less inclusive than today. That's for sure. No matter what you take, and I think a lot of research in the last 30 years, I would say, in history, has shown that liberalism and republicanism was not just a matter of elites or these big prohombres de la patria, those big names of próceres of the countries, but they were like adopted and used by subaltern actors and popular sectors, and that they claim and they fought for some sort of political inclusion using those words and categories that were established by Republican constitutions. And of course, they were negotiating, they were interpreting that in different ways. It's not that there was like just one meaning for a word like citizen or republic. But the thing is that it was part of the exchange and the negotiation of politics in the 19th century as well. So yes, so I think there is room for having a democratic republicanism that makes room for our democratic demands today. Yeah.
More questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how populism fits in your account of how we got here today, and sort of thinking about, I know we're talking about Latin America, and I'm sorry to be the person to ask you to situate it more globally, but thinking about Latin America in the context of a broader turn to populism and sort of on the left and the right.
I didn't get the last sentence.
Just that populism is happening on both sides of
Yes.
the political aisle.
Okay. Yeah. So my sense would be that, yeah, I see republicanism as in many sense, the opposite of populism, especially when you think about the way in which the public resources are used, in the sense of having a government that sees citizens as equal and that can assure a redistribution of opportunities, of different resources that the government can distribute, and that it's not driven by clientelism or patrimonialism, which have been for a long time the way in which populism distributes assets and resources in Latin America. So, so especially if we talk about republic as a government, I think it's clearly different. If we think about as a like more in a social side, I would say that I would like to have some sort of republicanism that is popular, right? I would say that main problem from republicanism and liberalism in Latin America, contemporary and especially in the last decades, but I would say that this is something that has been there for a while, is that has been ideas shared by urban elites, and with not that much popular support. It had much more popular support in the 19th century than in the 20th century, because of course for many reasons. But in recent decades, and I think that could be traced in different countries, but the clear, like more Democrats, institutionalist candidates are having a hard time to convince people about that agenda. I think in Latin America, you have some popular capitalism, for example, in the sense of people believing in that sort of capitalism in popular sectors. And of course the left as well, but the liberals and what you could name republicanists, they struggle to that. They don't have they're not rooted enough in society to make that possible. So yeah, I would say that the challenge is, in political terms, the challenge would be how to create a popular republicanism, and not just a set of values that are shared in well-to-do families and groups in urban cities. But if you take, I don't know, for example, I suppose Sergio Fajardo in Colombia could be like a classic example of someone like related to that, or Valentín Paniagua in Peru used to be, and Valentín Paniagua obtained 6% of the vote when he was candidate, and Fajardo twice has had like 3% of the vote, and I'm afraid, for example, someone like Larreta in Argentina in the next elections can resemble that. So it's hard to, especially in this moment of harsh polarizations in different countries, it is difficult to play this card, which at the end of the day looks like a centrist Democrat position, right? But I think that's a challenge in democratic terms.
Hi, thank you. I'm not sure if it's more of a question, but then I don't know. It has to do with everything you say about Latin America seems to me to be also applicable to the United States at this point, but in a, less, the volume's down here, right? But increasingly turned up. And so going back to Leah's comment about populism, right? That's one of the factors. But the other one has to do with, the possibilities of capitalism, right? So that you're suggesting that, if there were more free and open competition, it would be better. And seems to me that that's absolutely true. But it's in the context of a world where there's much less of that, right? Because of globalization, global capitalism and the monopolies that, just like take Twitter or Bezos or, whatever it is. So I guess I'm trying to, part of it has to do with, in your pessimism, is the United States is, like the world is going to go the way of Latin America, or the one little crack of, light that you pointed to is that, that academics can kind of, think about the problem and present it. So I guess I just wanted you to think about it in that context.
Okay. Yes, so all this happened. Yeah, I agree. It's a moment of deglobalization, right? Because we're back in a war times. So yeah, so all this is happening. Several of these processes, of course, are shared in not only with the states but with other countries.
Of America, the Americas.
Yeah,
right?
the Americas, sure. The difference maybe is that in the States and in Europe, there is this sense of there was a moment after World War II when there was a project of maybe more integrated, cohesive society, and which in Europe they call, like the French, the Trente Glorieuses, right? The 3 decades in which, and so there is this sense of that, for example, the accumulation of wealth is going back to 19th century levels, right? The difference is that we don't have that in Latin America. We don't have the sense that we're going back. We're like stuck. There was no great moment of a more equalitarian social order or political order. Yeah, so I think that's part of a difference in that moment. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering the comment.
I think it's the idea about the future. It's stagnated here, but given the conditions that are changing in the world, whether that means stagnation other places as well, sort of thing.
Yeah, that makes the situation harder. And also, if we see the global trend for Latin America, you have, like, I don't know, depending on how we count, but in the last 70 years, how many countries passed from underdeveloped to developed countries? Very few. And no one was Latin American. Even our best cases, like Uruguay or Chile or Costa Rica, have not passed that threshold, right? So that's that indicates that it's harder to achieve. That it's not something that it's not. I'm not trying to make the argument of it's a matter of will, and we will get it. I don't. Jaime Sabines, the Mexican poet, has this verse that I like. This, no he venido a entretenerlos con la esperanza, right? Haven't come to entertain you with hope. And so I think that's the thing. It's like, realistically, I would say that I'm confident that many countries could achieve that. But at the same time, I think very few will, if anyone, do that. Because it's not simple. It's hard. Yeah. Yep. I think question of that, or I don't know.
So,
Hi, Alberto. Sorry. Okay. First of all, thank you for your words, your talk. It was very interesting. So my first question has to do with the matter of like race. Growing up in Latin America, you have the perception, or at least there's like the social perception, that like race in Latin America is not the same as race in the United States. And like nowadays, there's this thought among Latin Americans that people in the United States are trying to impose the perceptions of race in the United States in Latin America, which I partly agree with, not completely, but it's like I understand where it comes from. But like in the sense that you were talking about stagnation in the economical aspect of it, I wanted to ask you, first of all, how should like Latin Americans start thinking about the real inequalities in race? So how do we face the issues of race that are real issues that maybe most Latin Americans haven't realized of them because of this narrative that like race doesn't exist among Latinos or in like different Latin American countries? Of course, contexts in different countries are different, but that is just my main question. How does political science, in your view, can help our republics better face this question of race in Latin America without like, of course, taking 100% a full view of like American politics, which is, well, that would be my first question. And the second question was like, the last part of what you said that 20% of the citizens of Latin America were complete citizens, 70% of the citizens were like half citizens. And you talked about rights. So I wanted to talk about like specifically a couple of examples about like rights that people from this 70% don't have. I just wanted to know like about specific rights or about what you meant about that concept of citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to give you an example that that I couldn't include in the book, but it's a personal experience. A friend of mine, so she died of cancer at 50, and her daughter, who's 18 years old, they never knew who was the father. The father, they know who he is, but the father never give any money for them. And okay, so here's this girl alone in the world, and so she reached me and said, so now that mom's died, I mean, I need to pay university. They are for sure they're not the poorest person, but they are poor in Lima. Okay, they're humble, let's say. And so she said, I would like to try to find my dad and force him to pay, as the law requires, my university. So I said, okay, I'm going to help you with that. I will call. I mean, I did law as undergrad, and so I'm gonna go back to my fellow friends from those years, and we will find the way that this guy pays. Okay, all my friends gave me next answer. They said, don't think about it. It's going to be too long. You will not be able to win anything. It's a process, a judiciary process that will take 3 or 4 years in order to force him to pay. Once he will be forced to pay, he will be already finished the university. So don't think about it. Okay, I said, well. So I told this girl what happened, and then she said, the firm where my mom used to work and where I work, they don't want to pay the whole amount of money that they should, because my mom worked there for several years. And now they want to fire me. Do you think we can do something? So again, I thought, yeah, for sure we will be able to do something. Again, I looked for my lawyer friends, and they said, very hard. You can open a process in the Minister of Work, of Labor, and I mean, the smart thing is try to negotiate and get from them all what you can. That's what you should do. So here we are in front of a 18-year-old woman, girl, that lives in Lima, that goes to university, and that is unable to protect very basic rights, right? And so she lives in a world of uncertainty and fear. There is not a lawless world at the end of the day, in which so that's the life for most Latin American people every day. A lot of uncertainty from a state, a government, a republic that is unable to assure that social interactions are really structured by the law. And I think that's the basic part of why is this situation that these semi-citizens. And regarding your question on race, I'm not a specialist on the issue. I tend to agree on that and on other topics that just to export some categories and ways of studying things from one side to the other is not the smartest thing to do. But again, almost like, because this is a book that I'm trying to integrate knowledge from different disciplines. So I've been taking different things from reading a lot of stuff, and so no, but I'm not doing myself research on that. So I could not help you in that question. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. And your last comment about that poor girl was really hard to hear. It's very sad. And my question was about the role of the militarism. First of all, the military is anti-democratic, but also is a place where poor people go to get their life going in terms of a career. And what is the impact of that role of the military on those societies?
The military, right? Well, the sphere where I can see more clearly that is in politics, and unfortunately they are having more clout this recent year in some countries, of course. For example, Bolsonaro in Brazil filled a lot of posts of the cabinet with former militaries. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela did the same thing. He was himself someone coming from the military. It is clear that Bukele in El Salvador has an alliance with them. Today in Peru, Dina Boluarte, the president, has some sort of pact or alliance with the military in a dimension that we had not seen in long time. And so yeah, so that's part of the, I suppose, the times of trouble for democracy, is that actors that should not participate in politics are getting back in there. In some countries, of course. In others, it is completely unthinkable that the military would put a foot in the political process. I mean, Argentina, for example, Argentina has a clear consensus on that. That is impossible. But in other countries, it's not the case. So yeah, I would say that that's the concerning situation in some cases in several countries.
Hi, Alberto. Just thinking about then the title of your book, you talk about defraudadas instead of fallidas. I mean, defrauded means a fraud. Somebody has committed a fraud. And also thinking in your Perú País de Ciudadanos sin República, and thinking about who defraud them. I'm not to ascertain blame, but rather responsibility. We're talking about elites, but also vanguardias, isn't it? I mean, what did the vanguardias did for us, whatever that means, in the past? And focusing on your pessimism, but appealing to your optimism. I mean, you have a baby, and when you have a baby, you have to be some sort of optimist about the future. And appealing also to your ensayo error, isn't it? I mean, who's responsible for this fraud and how to fix it? And is it fixable?
Yeah, first, I think I didn't want to use fail because I don't think they are fully failed. At the end of the day, it's as I said, I mean, this is not a black and white story, right? That's why I like the Rubén Blades line. It's like, sin ser esclavo tampoco está en libertad. That's claroscuro what I'm interested. And so that's why I think defraudada is better than the drastic failed, right? Even betrayed, I think, is a little stronger than defraudada in English. And who's responsible? Who's guilty for that? I think we have to accept that it's a communal failure with different people and social sectors playing their card on that. I think it is clear that elites have been in several places in several times, actors willing to exclude in many ways, from race or from supporting coups or with these practices in the way they organize the economic system in ways that they can basically extract wealth from those countries. I mean, that's clear. At the same time, I don't want to romanticize the citizens. I think citizens are the great asset of democracy and republicanism. At the same time, I'm not naive on that. I mean, citizens many times have sided with non-republican or non-democratic options. I mean, if we think about the authoritarian governments in the post-Cold War era, let's say in the last 30, 40 years in Latin America, all the authoritarian regimes were built with the enthusiastic support of the majority of citizens, were not built against citizens. Chavez, Fujimori, Bukele, they didn't destroy democracy against the will of citizens. They destroyed with the support of citizens. So, so sometimes we are responsible as well for that decaying of democracy. At the same time, I think it's the asset that you have, that citizens can side with the democratic and republican promises, and that they are the main asset to try to change those situations. So again, I don't have a clear, drastic, tajante answer on who is guilty and who is not. I think we are all, in some moments, guilty, and in some moments we're assets for democratization. I don't think we can just say there are good and bads in this kind of super complex political processes, right? Yeah.
Anyone else? I have a question for you, Alberto. Going back what Emma asked about the republic system, or this content with the republic system, and I want to bring this alternative point or perspective from certain Latin American countries, or certain sectors of Latin American countries, like Bolivia and the Andes. I know you work more focused like in the Andean nations. The plurinational state, nation state, and that brings the idea of political participation of indigenous people with gender parity, and how do they want to build a more equal, more democratic, more democratic society by bringing a new plurinational constitution and many other change, more structural change, right? So I don't know if your book dialogue with this kind of political kind of new social pact or social order that can bring more equal development of the country, like we haven't seen maybe in Bolivia, and recently there was a debate, constitutional process in Chile, and there is a certain debate also in Peru. So I want to bring perhaps in that area, how do you frame this new political perspectives in this historical republican system that your book are talking about?
Yeah, I actually my dissertation and the PhD dissertation and the book coming out of that dissertation was a comparison on Bolivia and Peru, and I did a lot of field work in Bolivia when Morales was president. So yeah, I think that's absolutely you have to include that sort of discussion in the political process. So that's not something that should be out of that. At the same time, the Bolivian experience shows that, and that's something that it's that you can be more democratic as a society, but not necessarily more democratic as a political community, right? Bolivia, of course, it had a great improvement in terms of inclusion during the Morales years, in terms of symbolic inclusion, and even there are researches on how the composition of Congress, for example, changed from the 90s to the 2000s, and so you might have a more democratic society. But I would go back to the Tocqueville framework, right? Like, so one thing is like to have the égalité de conditions, the equality of conditions, which is a democratic society. But you also need institutions that make freedom possible. And unfortunately, at least in the Bolivian case, let's say the democratic experiment by Morales ended up being like illiberal democracy. I mean, he decided to run for a fourth term against a referendum, against the will of the people, and that's no longer something that is supporting the idea of self-government, or the idea that you respect citizenship, and the idea is like, I will be candidate because I have to be the candidate. And it ended up like in a awful manner, right? With all the violence by the end of the government of Morales. So I think it's necessary to have a more democratic society, but it cannot come at the cost of not having a more democratic in the institutional and political sense of the word as well, I think. Yeah, but yeah, I think it's key part of the discussion, at least for some countries, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I guess with this we can conclude. Thank you very much, Alberto, and congratulations again for the book. It's coming soon. And thank you for all of you coming today. And I'll see you next week for our next Thursday lecture series.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. Thank you.